The man across the table speaks with the polished confidence of the British establishment. He knows the names of your agents, their drop zones, their radio codes, and the hour they will cross the border. You believe he is protecting them, but before some of those men even receive their orders, Moscow may already know they are coming. His name is Kim Philby, and for almost 3 decades, one of Britain's most trusted intelligence officers served the enemy he had been hired to hunt. This is not simply the story of a brilliant spy. It is the story of an institution that saw every warning, heard every accusation, and still could not imagine that treason might wear the right school tie. Harold Adrian Russell Philby arrived at Trinity College, Cambridge in 1929. Friends called him Kim. He came from the world Britain instinctively trusted. The son of a celebrated imperial official, educated at Westminster, intelligent, charming, and socially fluent. He also had a slight stammer that made him seem vulnerable rather than dangerous. Cambridge in the early 1930s was fertile ground for political conversion. The Great Depression had shaken faith in capitalism. Fascism was advancing across Europe. To some privileged young students, communism appeared not as Soviet repression, but as the only force prepared to resist a collapsing and unjust order. Philby was not alone. Guy Burgess was brilliant, reckless, and impossible to ignore. Donald Maclean was intense and idealistic. Anthony Blunt hid his convictions behind the controlled manners of an art historian. John Cairncross, later identified as the 5th member of the group, followed his own path into government. They did not operate as 5 men sitting around one table planning history. What connected them was more dangerous: access, ideology, and a British system that trusted pedigree more than scrutiny. In 1934, after Philby had worked with left-wing activists in Vienna, Soviet intelligence brought him into its service. One of the key recruiters was Arnold Deutsch, an Austrian-born Soviet intelligence officer who understood that an ideological agent could be more valuable than a paid informer. Money might buy a document. Belief could buy a lifetime. Deutsch did not ask Philby to steal university papers. He gave him a more patient assignment: erase the visible radical, cultivate respectability, and enter the institutions that governed Britain. Philby withdrew from overt communist activity. He remade himself as a conservative journalist and reported from Spain during the Civil War from the nationalist side. The disguise worked because it did not look like a disguise. It looked like a young Englishman returning to his natural class. When the Second World War began, British intelligence expanded rapidly. Recruitment was often informal. A recommendation, a family connection, or the approval of the right man could open doors that a serious investigation might have kept closed. Philby entered the Secret Intelligence Service in 1940. Inside MI6, he excelled. He was disciplined, analytically sharp, and willing to work through the night. Colleagues saw a man consumed by duty. Moscow saw a source moving steadily toward the center of British power. Documents were copied onto microfilm. Operations, assessments, and identities crossed from one intelligence service to another, while Philby continued to earn promotions. Then, in 1944, the institutional nightmare became almost absurd. Philby was placed in charge of Section 9, a unit concerned with Soviet and communist activity. Britain had positioned a Soviet agent inside the machinery designed to detect Soviet penetration. From that desk, Philby did not need to break into locked offices. The warnings came to him. In August 1945, Konstantin Volkov, a Soviet vice consul in Istanbul, approached the British. He offered intelligence in exchange for asylum and money. Among his claims was information pointing to Soviet agents inside British institutions, including men in the Foreign Office and Intelligence Service. The message reached London and landed in the worst possible place, Philby's section. Imagine Volkov waiting in Istanbul. Every passing car might belong to the British officers coming to extract him, or it might belong to Moscow. He had already crossed the line that Soviet defectors rarely crossed twice. Once his offer was known, there was no return to ordinary life. Philby immediately understood the threat. If Volkov spoke freely, his career, and perhaps the entire Cambridge network, could collapse. Philby alerted his Soviet contacts. He was then sent to handle the case, but delays consumed the response. Travel arrangements, authorization, and procedure bought Moscow what it needed most: time. Before Philby reached Istanbul, Volkov disappeared. Reports later claimed that he and his wife were removed under Soviet guard, possibly carried aboard an aircraft while concealed or incapacitated. Their exact fate remains uncertain. What is known is that the defection never happened. Philby returned with professional regret. The institution accepted the loss as a failed opportunity. The officer who had the most to fear from Volkov remained above suspicion. The war ended, but Philby's access became even more valuable. In Washington, he served as Britain's senior intelligence liaison to American services. He exchanged secrets with men who treated him as a partner and a friend. Among them was CIA officer James Jesus Angleton, whose later obsession with hidden moles would be shaped by the discovery that Philby had been lying to him across dinner tables and classified files. The cost was no longer theoretical. Beginning in the late 1940s, Britain and the United States backed attempts to insert anti-communist agents into Albania under a program commonly associated with Operation Valuable. Other Western operations targeted Soviet-controlled territory farther east. Some teams landed by sea, others entered by air. Many were captured or killed. Philby had access to sensitive planning and passed intelligence to Moscow. But the exact number of deaths directly attributable to him remains disputed, and the failures had more than one cause. Poor security, compromised exile groups, and Soviet counterintelligence all played roles. The defensible truth is already horrifying. Men entered hostile territory believing their plans were secret, while a senior Western officer was supplying Moscow with information about the operations built around them. Picture a radio operator crouched in a dark Albanian farmhouse, tapping out the recognition signal he had been given in training. A reply comes back with the correct code. He believes London is answering. Then boots move outside. The code did not save him. It confirmed where he was. Back in Washington, reports of failed insertions accumulated. Philby could listen to explanations, study mistakes, and appear troubled by losses that benefited the service he secretly obeyed. He did not need to pull a trigger. He only needed to keep being trusted. But encrypted Soviet communications from the 1940s were beginning to betray the network. The American-led Venona project gradually uncovered evidence of deeply placed Soviet agents. One trail pointed toward Donald Maclean, then a British diplomat who had handled sensitive Anglo-American material. By 1951, Maclean was in danger. Philby used Burgess to warn him. On May 25th, Burgess and Maclean left Britain, crossed to France, and disappeared into the Soviet bloc. Their escape detonated a political scandal. Burgess had recently been living in Philby's Washington home. Suspicion moved naturally toward the man connecting them. American intelligence no longer wanted Philby in Washington. CIA officer William King Harvey was among those who argued that Philby was compromised. Philby was recalled and forced out of his post. Yet suspicion was not proof. He was questioned, watched, and left in a gray zone where many believed him guilty, but prosecutors could not build a case they were willing to take to court. The British establishment also faced a humiliating choice. To expose Philby was to admit that its culture of confidence had protected a traitor at the center of intelligence. In 1955, Foreign Secretary Harold Macmillan told the House of Commons there was no evidence establishing that Philby had betrayed the country. Philby seized the moment. At a press conference in his mother's London apartment, reporters surrounded him beneath the lights. He held his pipe, controlled his stammer, and denied that he had ever been a communist or passed secrets to Moscow. The performance worked because it offered Britain the answer it wanted. Not innocence proven by evidence, innocence performed with the correct accent. Philby later went to Beirut as a journalist, reporting for The Observer and The Economist while maintaining contact with British intelligence. He lived between worlds again, useful enough to consult, suspicious enough never to be fully restored, and still carrying a secret that had destroyed other men. Then the past returned. Information from Soviet defector Anatoly Golitsyn intensified the search for penetrations. Separately, Flora Solomon, who had known Philby in the 1930s, told Victor Rothschild that Philby had once tried to recruit her for communist espionage. The accusation reached MI6. This was not one magical document providing undeniable proof. It was the final convergence of old suspicions, new testimony, and a pattern that could no longer be ignored. In January 1963, Nicholas Elliott, a senior MI6 officer and one of Philby's oldest friends, met him in Beirut. This was the confrontation the case had been moving toward for years. Elliott had defended Philby. He had shared the private world of intelligence with him. Now he sat across from a man whose friendship might have been another operational cover. Elliott laid out the case. Philby resisted, qualified, and then admitted enough to confirm the betrayal, though the extent and status of his confession remained complicated. Arrangements were discussed for another meeting and a fuller statement, but Elliott left him space. That decision remains one of the story's most haunting moments. Perhaps the service expected cooperation. Perhaps old friendship weakened professional caution. Perhaps officials preferred a quiet disappearance to a public trial that would expose decades of institutional failure. On the evening of January 23rd, Philby failed to appear at a dinner party. He had vanished from Beirut. He was later understood to have escaped aboard the Soviet cargo ship Dolmatova and made his way to Moscow. After years of warnings, intercepted messages, vanished defectors, failed operations, and escaped colleagues, the man at the center of the scandal had been left with one final opening. He took it. Philby expected the Soviet Union to receive him as a commander returning from the front. Instead, Moscow offered a quieter existence. He received an apartment, money, decorations, and eventual public honor. But Soviet officials initially treated him with caution. A man who had deceived one intelligence service for decades could never be entirely easy for another to trust. The communist future he had imagined at Cambridge had hardened into a bureaucratic police state. He drank heavily. He wrote a memoir defending his choices. He formed a new life in Moscow, but he could never recover the world he had destroyed to reach it. Philby died in 1988 and was buried with Soviet military honors. 3 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed. The state he had served survived him only briefly. The human consequences survived much longer. Kim Philby was a formidable intelligence asset, but his success was not his alone. He was protected by assumptions about class, loyalty, education, and belonging. British intelligence searched for the behavior of a traitor while overlooking the social appearance of one. Philby understood that weakness before many of the men he betrayed even knew it existed. So what truly protected him for so long? Soviet tradecraft, his personal brilliance, or an elite institution that could not imagine treason speaking in its own voice? Tell us in the comments. Subscribe for more declassified stories and continue to the next investigation. Because governments may seal their failures, but the modern ledger records what they hoped the world would forget.